Right. Hello and welcome everyone to the Ontario Farmland Trust December webinar. We're so happy to have you all here today with us to explore species at risk on farms. My name is Teresa. I'm the Communications and Community Outreach Coordinator at OFT. Before we begin this session, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. OFT works across Ontario, but we are centered in Guelph on treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit of the Anishinaabeg people, the original and ongoing protectors of these lands. Guelph resides on Treaty 3 between the Lakes Purchase Territory, representing an agreement and respectful partnership between peoples of different nations. As settler nations work to reconcile our relationships with Indigenous nations, we want our work at the Farmland Trust to reflect the respect deserved to the legacy of the original caretakers, whose stewardship of the land has allowed us to enjoy the land's beauty and bounty today. Especially given that the role of land as possession has been used as a tool of colonization, this context is really important for us to acknowledge. I'd now like to introduce some webinar housekeeping. So throughout the webinar, we encourage participants to share comments in the chat, as well as please feel free to introduce yourself. It's so great to see who's here with us and where you're coming from. And if you have any questions for Meagan throughout the webinar, you can submit those using the Q&A feature. If you have a similar question to any that's already been submitted, you can upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up icon, and this will just move the question up in the queue, allowing us to answer the most popular questions first. I'll be on hand to support during the webinar, so if you have any technical issues, you can message me directly using the chat feature. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar with OFT, allow me to introduce us. We are a not-for-profit and the only provincial wide conservation organization with a mission dedicated to the protection and preservation of Ontario's agricultural landscapes. And it's so critical that these lands are protected because Ontario's prime agricultural land is a finite, non-renewable resource that comprises less than 5% of Ontario's land base. Farmland is the foundation of the agri-food sector that provides us with locally produced foods, employs more than 800,000 Ontarians, and contributes over 49 billion annually to the province's GDP. And yet Ontario has lost 20% of our farmland in the last 40 years. The rate of farmland loss has nearly doubled between 2016 and 2021 to a rate of 319 acres per day. And once farmland is developed, it's gone forever. So it is more important now than ever before that we protect our agricultural landscapes. So what exactly does OFT do to accomplish our mission? Well, we have three program areas, or a few main program areas, and the first of them is to permanently protect farmland. We do that by working with farmland owners who want to protect their lands from future development. We do this by placing a farmland easement agreement on the title of their property, or if they wish, they can donate their farm property to OFT. We also engage in provincial policy discussions on changing land use policy that impacts farmland, as well as our education and community engagement programming includes several outreach initiatives that aim to educate the public on what threatens these lands and how we can collectively work to protect them, including webinars like this one. To date, we have permanently protected 26 properties amounting to over 2,700 acres of farmland, forest, and wetlands across the province. On this map, you'll see places in which we've permanently protected farmland, as well as where our current projects are taking place. I'd also like to mention that it is not without the support of our dedicated donors and supporters that we're able to make such an impact on farmland preservation. And with that, we will begin the webinar today. For this webinar, we are so happy to have ecologist Meagan Morey from Blazing Star Environmental join us here, sharing her expertise on species at risk. Meagan specializes in species at risk conservation and recovery through research, monitoring, and land stewardship, with a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Environmental Resource Science from Trent University, and an advanced diploma in ecosystem management. She's collaborated with organizations like the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association and the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association to support farmers in protecting vulnerable habitats and species at risk. Meagan, thank you so much for joining us here today. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Bear with me here while I share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes. Actually, I don't think you're sharing. There we go.
Perfect.
Awesome. Looks great.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. My name is Meagan Morey. I'm an ecologist with Blazing Star Environmental, and today I'm going to be talking about species at risk found within Ontario's farmland. So I'll be providing a brief overview of species at risk and how they relate to agricultural lands in Ontario. I'll introduce you to some of the species we can expect to see in and around farmland, and then I'll cover some of the habitat stewardship and land management practices that can help these species. Okay, let's get started. Species at risk, what are they and why should we care about them? Species at risk are plants and animals that are in danger of becoming extinct or extirpated. And extirpated is just a fancy way of saying that they no longer exist within the province. There are over 200 species at risk in Ontario, and these species are the most vulnerable parts of biodiversity, and they require special attention to recover their populations and habitat. Species at risk contribute to the diversity that supports the ecosystems that we rely on. And keeping our ecosystems is really important so that we can continue to enjoy all of the goods and services that they provide to us. Ecosystem services can sometimes be easy to overlook, but they do have a really high economic value. And just to give you a few examples of the services ecosystems provide to Ontario farms, these include things like pollination, natural pest control, water filtration, and protection against flooding and erosion. Habitat loss and fragmentation are among the biggest threats to species at risk. And though natural habitats for wildlife are decreasing overall across the province, important habitats for these species are contained within the 12 million acres of farmland found within our province. Farms help maintain the grassland ecosystems that many species at risk rely on. Habitats needed for breeding, nesting, and foraging are also provided in places around the farm, including spaces like barns, windbreaks, streams and wetlands, woodlots, gardens, and marginal lands. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the species at risk you might find on farmland in Ontario. So these are species that have a range that overlaps with agricultural areas and those that are also known to use these types of habitat found in and around the farms. So not surprisingly, grassland birds are found in agricultural areas. Hayfields, pastures, and meadows provide the majority of habitat for these birds, since natural grassland ecosystems like tallgrass prairies and savannas have become incredibly rare in Ontario. Many grassland bird species are ground nesters that use vegetation to construct and conceal their nests placed directly on the ground. Several species are considered to be area sensitive, which means that they are a little picky about choosing areas that they'll be nesting in. Often they'll only select habitats that are 12 acres in size or larger. And not all grassland habitats are suitable for all grassland bird species. And this is because each species has its own set of preferences for things like the height of grasses, the openness, or the amount of trees and shrubs located within the habitat, and also the type and structure of ground vegetation that comprises the habitat. The first grassland bird species that I'm going to show you is, the grasshopper sparrow. And these birds are area sensitive, so they're found in large habitats, in large fields. And these fields tend to occur on shallow, well-drained soils where the vegetation is sparse and there's patches of bare ground. And this is a tricky species to spot because they're incredibly secretive. They spend most of their time very close to the ground, foraging for grasshoppers and other insects. And also being a sparrow, they can be pretty tricky to identify because Ontario sparrows are quite similar in appearance. So your best bet is to learn the call, which sounds a lot like a buzzing insect. They're known to occur in many areas across southern Ontario, so their distribution in the province is widespread. But again, they prefer those drier fields with sparse vegetation. The short-eared owl is an interesting one. It's one of the few ground nesting owl species that we have here in Canada. And they need really expansive areas of open habitat. And this can include things like wetlands, grasslands, and other agricultural areas. They choose their habitats based on food availability, and this makes them a nomadic species. So they settle in areas where rodent populations are abundant. Something interesting, during their courtship dances, the male flies really high up into the sky, and then dives down super fast towards the ground, clapping his wings frantically below his body and hooting continuously while he does this. And this process continues over and over until the female is ready to mate, which can sometimes be a while. This elaborate display can be seen in grasslands where they nest, so typically at dusk in early March. They have an incredibly large range in Ontario, but being nomadic, it's a little tricky to predict where they're going to be found from year to year. I've included the bobolink and eastern meadowlark on the same slide here because they share many similarities in terms of habitat preference and breeding activity. So both species are area sensitive and prefer open habitats dominated by moderately tall grasses. And unlike the short-eared owl, these birds often will return to the same breeding habitat year after year. Both species nest on the ground, and this process starts in May, and most of the young will have fledged by early July. The nesting period can last a bit longer. For example, if the nests are destroyed, the birds may make a second attempt. And though there are a lot of similarities between these species, they are quite different visually. We've got the bobolink on the bottom right there, and the female does have banding on the back that is somewhat similar to eastern meadowlark. The main thing to look for in this case is the yellow breast and black collar present on eastern meadowlark. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on species identification just because we only have a very short time together today. But I do have some good identification resources to share with you at the end of my presentation. So some practices you can do to help support ground nesting grassland birds include delayed haying, so leaving fields uncut until after young birds have fledged. You can also do this selectively by choosing to leave the area uncut where most birds are nesting. A similar strategy can be applied to grazing systems where a paddock is left to rest while birds are nesting. And if possible, you could consider allowing one of your fields to rest for the entire year to provide consistent, nesting habitat on an annual basis. Preventing woody vegetation from encroaching on grasslands is another way to help these species because they have a pretty low tolerance for trees and shrubs, so removing them is a good way to make sure that the habitat remains suitable for them. Another option is to plant a high legume content in fields that are frequently managed during the nesting period. So since most grassland birds will avoid nesting in fields seeded with a mixture containing 25% or more alfalfa, doing this will help keep them out of harm's way. Another species at risk bird that frequents farmland is the loggerhead shrike. And unlike the other species we've seen so far, they actually prefer habitats with short grasses and scattered trees and shrubs. They also have quite a unique hunting style where they will use sharp objects like thorns and barbed wire fences to impale their prey. And you perhaps wouldn't expect such behavior from a bird with this sort of innocent looking appearance. But if you look closely, they do have a sharp hooked bill. However, the feet don't offer much gripping power, so they need those sharp objects to hold their larger prey items like mice and frogs while they eat. Their distribution across the province is relatively patchy. So looking at the map, we can see the greatest concentration is in Eastern Ontario and the Kawartha Lakes region. You can help loggerhead shrike by maintaining and improving habitat in areas where they occur. So this could include planting suitable nest trees, so those densely branched and thorny species like red cedar and hawthorn, and by frequently cutting or grazing fields to keep grasses short. I will note that when implementing practices to help species at risk, you should first consider where the species occurs relative to the location of your farm. This is especially important for species with conflicting needs. So just as an example, if I decided to plant trees in my field and keep the grass really short to help loggerhead shrike, but my farm is in Chatham, that's not going to be very helpful because loggerhead shrike doesn't occur in that area. And at the same time, it has the potential to negatively impact the grassland bird species that are in my area because many of them like habitats that are different than that. So they like the longer grass and prefer to have no trees or shrubs. Another frequent flyer of farms, of course, is the barn swallow. They can be found foraging for insects over open areas like ponds and wetlands, meadows, pastures, and along field edges. Farmland is incredibly important to this species because they prefer human-made structures over natural options for nesting. A great way to help the barn swallow is by simply allowing them to nest in and around your barns and outbuildings. You can also install metal flashing or other slippery material below the nests to help protect their offspring from predators. The American badger uses a variety of habitats found on farmland, including grasslands, open forests, and windbreaks or hedgerows. Being a burrowing animal, their range is limited to areas that have cohesive soils that are able to support the formation of their tunnels and dens. They are a semi-nomadic species and will move between several burrows throughout their territory. Nursing mothers, however, will stay in the same maternity den until her offspring are ready to set out on their own. And in southern Ontario, American badgers are mostly found in areas situated along the northern shore of Lake Erie. And since these animals are often on the move and use a variety of habitats, planting vegetated corridors like windbreaks, hedgerows, and shelter belts can help connect natural habitats and provide cover for badgers. Some other things to consider if you find yourself in this region of the province would be to keep your eyes peeled while you're driving at night. Badgers are at an elevated risk of vehicle collisions because they often cross roads in search of prey while they hunt at night. And just being mindful of any burrows while operating machinery around farmland in this area can help to protect the burrows of this species. Little brown myotids can be found foraging over grasslands, ponds, and wetlands. During the day, they roost in trees and human-made structures like barns and attics. These bats eat a lot of insects. The average individual will consume about half their own body weight's worth in insects every night, and nursing mothers nearly triple this, eating more than their weight's worth of insects in a single night. This is actually one of the few bat species that will regularly use human structures for maternity colonies. So females will gather in these structures, using them as a safe space to give birth and raise their one and only offspring of the year. So some things you can do to help species at risk bats include installing roost boxes near areas where they forage, limiting disturbance like artificial lighting, and refraining from cutting trees down until bats have moved to their overwintering areas. You can also hang on to dead standing trees because they provide excellent habitat for bats, and then avoiding any renovations in buildings while they're occupied by bats is a good way to protect them. The western forest frog can be found in lowland habitats like woodlands, pastures, and fallow fields. They require shallow, fish-free aquatic environments for breeding, which can include flooded fields, ponds, and other wetlands. They're very difficult to spot, but you may recognize them as being one of the first frogs you hear in spring. Their call sounds a bit like if you were to run your fingers over the teeth of a comb. These frogs typically don't stray too far from the areas that they breed in, so a helpful practice for western forest frog is maintaining vegetation between breeding sites and other natural habitats located nearby so that they can travel between these areas safely. Installing exclusion fencing is another practice that can help protect the breeding habitat and offspring of the species if the fencing is installed around breeding habitat. Eastern fox snake is one of the longer snake species we have here in Ontario, with adults reaching a length of about 1 meter. They can be found in a wide variety of habitats, ranging from wetlands to grasslands, and even some treed habitats like hedgerows. As a reptile, this species relies on habitat structures to regulate its body temperature, and it seeks out features that offer humidity and protection like garden compost, leaf litter, and logs to lay its eggs. The fox snake is a very docile species, but they may pretend to be a little more threatening by vibrating their tails to mimic a rattlesnake. Fox snakes require natural corridors to move between the different habitats they use for nesting and hibernation. So implementing linear plantings like windbreaks and shelter belts to connect these different habitats is very helpful for this species. You can also include structures like leaf piles and logs to provide habitat for nesting and thermoregulation. And since rodents make up a large portion of their diet, avoiding the use of rodenticides whenever possible is also really beneficial for this species. All species of Ontario turtles are at risk. Three I've included here on this slide are the ones most commonly found in agricultural areas. These turtles are typically found in aquatic environments like ponds and other wetlands, but they do travel over land between different habitats that they use for nesting and hibernation. So you may come across them on your lawns, pastures, laneways, and other areas around the farm. Turtles nest on land and they choose sandy or gravelly areas with plenty of sun exposure to keep their eggs warm. And some of the ways you can help species at risk turtles. Sorry, my mouse is being a little crazy right now. Yeah, sorry. So some of the ways you can help turtles is by creating safe nesting habitat. So this would include adding sandy and gravelly soils in the sunny areas near the wetlands on your property. You can also add logs to your water features to provide structures for turtles to bask on. Conserving and restoring natural wetlands is also a really good way to help these species who very heavily rely on these habitats. Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee is found in a wide variety of open habitats, but they've only recently been observed in a few select locations in the province. Part of the reason for this is because Suckley's cuckoo is a parasitic species, meaning that it relies on other bumblebee species to raise its young, which are also in decline. Only females that have mated will continue into the following year by overwintering in plant material or rotten logs. The yellow-banded bumblebee is also found in a wide range of habitats that contain flowering plants. It's an important pollinator for early blooming species, including crops like apples and blueberries. It nests underground in abandoned rodent burrows, where in addition to its own offspring, it may raise the young of parasitic species like the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee. There are many things you can do to support the pollinators found on your property. So one of the major ones would be to create a pollinator garden or just simply introducing flowering plants to windbreaks, pathways, and marginal lands. This can go a really long way in helping these species, particularly if you choose a variety of native plants that flower at different times of the year, because they provide early and late season nectar resources for these animals. And minimizing the use of pesticides and taking care to avoid spraying natural areas where pollinators are foraging when they are applied can help reduce harm to these species. And since many bee species nest underground and within 30 centimeters of the soil surface, adopting reduced tillage practices can help protect the nests and offspring of these species. Another pollinator is the monarch, and I'm sure most of you are aware that monarch caterpillars need milkweed in order to survive. But what you may not know is that monarch can sometimes confuse dog strangling vine, which is an invasive plant, with milkweed, and they can end up laying their eggs on the wrong plant. So removing dog strangling vine, if any exists on your property, and replacing it with native milkweed plants is a good way to help this pollinator species. I have a few more practices to share with you, and these are just general practices that can benefit a wide range of species at risk and other wildlife. So ensuring that manure and fertilizers are stored safely helps to maintain healthy ecosystems by preventing the introduction of additional nutrients into natural environments. Updating damaged or outdated stream crossings can help protect important habitat for aquatic species. Installing a flushing bar and mowing beginning at the center of a field and working toward the outward edges can help all kinds of species because it provides them with a little extra time to move out of harm's way. And then using fencing to exclude livestock from natural spaces like wetlands and other areas that provide important habitat for sensitive species helps maintain high quality habitat for species at risk and other wildlife. You can also contribute by becoming a citizen scientist. So you can join a monitoring program to collect and share data on species at risk. Some examples include the Marsh Monitoring Program, the Western Forest Frog Program, and SwiftWatch. Or you can contribute by reporting species at risk sightings, by submitting your observations on the web or through mobile apps. And these include initiatives like iNaturalist, eBird, Bumblebee Watch, and they're large databases that can be used in science to track and monitor species at risk over time. So I've spoken a lot about the ways that you can help species at risk. But what about help for farmers? Implementing practices that benefit species at risk can sometimes require a lot of time and planning and maintenance, and they may also have an impact on your operation. So though it's great to help species at risk, it can be really challenging sometimes for farmers to adopt some of these practices. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the resources that are out there to assist farmers. There are many provincial and nationally led programs available to farmers. And these programs can provide funding and other support for projects like restoring natural ecosystems and enhancing habitat for species at risk, upgrading stream crossings, nutrient management plans, cover and intercropping, exclusion fencing, and grazing and haying practices. So I created a document that contains links to some of these programs. I'm just touching on them very quickly here, but for anyone who's interested, please feel free to follow those links for more information. Some other resources that you might find helpful include the Habitat and Biodiversity Assessment Tool. So it's a free to use online tool designed to assist farmers in helping species at risk. It works by recommending stewardship practices based on the species that are likely to be located near your farm. It also provides you with a list of funding and support programs that are related to the practices that it recommends. This is a brand new tool, and it's set to launch any day now. So if anyone does follow the link for this and it's not up yet, please just give it a few days and try again. And then finally, some other resources that can provide additional information, including some tips for identifying species, include the Species at Risk Ontario webpage, which is stored on Environment and Climate Change Canada's website, and then conservation organizations like Ontario Nature and the Nature Conservancy. A really good mobile app actually for bird ID is Merlin, and it will analyze bird calls, which is a really reliable way to identify them. So that can be really helpful as well. Hi, I think I'm pretty much at my time limit, so I will cut it off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was really informative. And it's so great to highlight all the different species and the biodiversity that exists all around Ontario and farmland. So that's awesome. I will now open up the floor to any questions. Again, please use the Q&A feature. And yeah, submit your questions there. But while we wait, I do have a question, Megan. Do you have any, or can you share a success story from your work where a farmland habitat initiative was significantly benefited a species at risk?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that jumps out in my mind are the wetland restoration projects. So these are implemented in spaces where either a previously occurring wetland has been filled or degraded, or there's an opportunity to create a wetland in a low-lying area on farmland. And these are incredibly beneficial because they help a very wide variety of species at risk. And it's so neat to monitor these habitats after they've been implemented, because you get to see all of the native vegetation coming in and all of the wetland species moving in. And it always amazes me because when you look around, you don't really see many other wetlands, but somehow these species find their way there. And it's wonderful to see.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Is there a specific species at risk that you maybe have only encountered a few times and that like excites you to see again whenever you do?
Ooh, so many. One that jumps out to me is the eastern fox snake. I am a big snake fan, and those ones in particular are just exceptionally beautiful. And I really like watching them navigate through wetlands, and I find that their orange coloring really pops against the contrast of green vegetation and the water.
Awesome. We do have a question here. We created 9 wetlands on our land in 2024, and now we need to dress it up in favor of the wild. Any info about links to someone or resources for someone that will help them do the right thing on the first time. Let me know if you need me to repeat.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I don't know if I'll be sharing the document or maybe you, Teresa, but I did compile a list of really good resources, and there are some items in there specific to wetland projects.
Awesome. Yeah, I will be sharing that link to all registrants, so you can all look out for that. And I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you, Megan, again.
Hop in if I can quickly,
Oh
actually.
yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I'd seen a comment in the chat earlier that I thought getting Meagan your perspective on this would be really interesting. And it was from Kat, who's here with the whole team from Ontario Streams. They're tuning in today, so welcome everyone from Ontario Streams. They were hoping to learn more about communicating with farm owners about species at risk and how they can take stewardship action on their hands. And what I find interesting about that question and our position at the Ontario Farmland Trust is we have landowners reaching out to us who are already very conservation-minded landowners, hence why they're reaching out to us, being a conservation organization, wanting to protect both the agricultural and natural features on their property. And I'd be curious if you have any experience that you might be able to impart your wisdom onto Kat, the folks at Ontario Streams, and other folks who are joining in today as well.
Yeah, great question. I have a similar experience to you, Martin, where oftentimes the farmers and producers that I'm in contact with are already very conservation minded. And it is challenging to cross that barrier, particularly because I feel that there's a misconception for things like species at risk being on someone's property could be perceived as a potentially bad thing, whereas it's in reality, it's a good thing. There are a lot of programs out there offering funding to landowners that do support these species. So I guess raising awareness of these programs and the benefits of conservation and supporting species at risk might be a good way to bridge that barrier.
Thanks, Meagan.
Awesome. So yeah, no more questions have been asked so far. Actually, there's one that just came up from Amanda. Meagan, I was just forced by my city to bring down 3 deceased trees along the fence line of my field. And when I told the city they needed to do their due diligence and check that these trees were not important nesting sites for birds, etc., they just sloughed it off and told me to cut the trees or face fines. How do we go about educating officials about conservation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, especially because at the municipal level, a lot of things can vary between regions in terms of, the approaches they take and the interests they have and the resources that they value. I think some examples of good ways to approach that would be writing letters to local governing bodies to share opinions and concerns. That could be a good way to work at that really sort of local level of governance.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I will close out the webinar. Again, thank you, Meagan, for your expertise and for being here with us today. If folks are, yeah, thank you. If folks are looking to get more involved with OFT, you can follow us and stay up to date with us on social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and X, as well as you can subscribe to our newsletter. They go out monthly. You can also become a member or a donor or volunteer to help accelerate our farmland protection initiatives. And finally, our webinars and events do not end here. We have one coming up in January. The webinar will be about farming with conservation in mind, as well as we have our annual Farmland Forum happening on March 20th, 2025. So you can stay tuned for the registration opening in the new year. Also, if you enjoyed this webinar and you would like to see more webinars in the future, please feel free to consider donating to OFT. I will insert a link in the chat for you to visit, as well as completing our webinar feedback form so that we can continue improving our webinar offerings. You'll be anonymous, so just wanted to let you know that. And that is all for today. Thank you all once again for joining us. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Martin. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.